The servants' hall at Ashford Hall occupied that peculiar netherworld below stairs where the architecture underwent a subtle democratic transformation. Where the family quarters above spoke of Victorian certainty and mahogany authority, the servant spaces breathed a different atmosphere altogether, one of worn stone, practical efficiency, and the sort of intimate knowledge that made butlers and housemaids considerably more dangerous to murder investigations than the family itself. Whimsy had always maintained that the solving of crime was largely a matter of understanding which servants actually paid attention to which doors and windows, a conviction that had served him remarkably well over the years. Mrs. Craven, the housekeeper, was a woman of perhaps 60, with the formidable aspect of someone who had spent decades enforcing order upon chaos and had emerged from the conflict with her composure intact, but her sympathy rather badly dented. She sat with her hands folded upon her lap in precisely the manner that indicated she considered this entire conversation a breach of professional protocol, undertaken only under sufferance and the gentle insistence of the young master. "Colonel Ashford was a creature of absolute habit, my lord," she began, with the air of a woman stating the obvious to someone of considerably limited understanding. "Retired at 10:30 precisely. His light would extinguish by 11. Morning tea at 7. Never a variation in 15 years of my employment here. A man of military precision," Whimsy observed, settling himself into a chair that seemed designed for maximum discomfort. "One presumes such rigidity occasionally produced complications. Guests arriving outside the appointed hours, or unexpected social obligations that disrupted his carefully calibrated schedule." Mrs. Craven's lips compressed into something between a smile and a grimace. "The colonel had very few guests, my lord. He was not a sociable man, if I may be frank. His son would visit occasionally, Mr. Richard, but beyond that and the vicar's quarterly visits, the house saw little company." "And last night?" Whimsy leaned back, affecting an air of disinterested curiosity that was wholly deceptive. "The colonel retired at his customary hour." "He did, my lord. I saw him ascend the stairs myself at approximately 10:30. His valet, James, had prepared his evening ablutions, and all was as it should have been." Whimsy's fingers tapped once against the arm of the chair, a small gesture, barely noticeable, but one that James, had he been present, would have recognized as the prelude to several uncomfortable questions. "And you heard nothing unusual during the night? No footsteps upon the stairs, no sounds of distress or confusion?" The housekeeper's hesitation was infinitesimal, but it was there. "I sleep in the east wing, my lord, above the kitchens. One does not generally hear the upper floors from that distance." "Quite so, but someone does sleep near the stairs, I should imagine. Someone who might have occasion to move about during the night hours." "There is the second housemaid, my lord, Nellie Marks. Her room overlooks the landing." It took Whimsy approximately 4 minutes to locate Nellie Marks, who turned out to be a girl of perhaps 19 with the wide-eyed alertness of someone who had very recently discovered that she was considerably more important than anyone had previously suggested. She was inclined toward nervousness, which Whimsy found promising. Nervous people tended to be either guilty of something or in possession of genuinely useful information, and occasionally, most entertainingly, both. "You heard the colonel fall, then?" Whimsy asked, settling himself across from her in the small sitting room that had been offered for their interview. Not exactly, my lord. Not heard him fall, precisely. What I heard was the door, his study door, opening near about 2:30, I should think, though I cannot be certain of the precise time. And this was unusual." Nellie nodded vigorously, her hands clasped together in her lap. "Very unusual, my lord. The colonel's habits were absolute. He did not rise during the night hours. Never. At least, not in the 4 years I have been employed here. Yet you were awake at 2:30 in the morning." The girl's cheeks flushed, and she cast her eyes downward with the elaborate casualness of someone attempting to appear perfectly innocent while being anything but. "I sometimes cannot sleep, my lord. When I cannot sleep, I sit by my window and read. The moonlight was quite bright last night." Whimsy accepted this explanation with a gracious nod that suggested he believed her implicitly, which they both understood to mean he believed no such thing. "And after you heard the door open?" "I heard footsteps, my lord. On the landing, moving toward the stairs. At first, I thought perhaps the colonel was unwell, might need assistance, but then I heard what sounded like someone descending, rather quickly, and then silence. I waited quite some time, listening for the sound of his return, but there was nothing more until the valet's cry this morning, when he discovered the body. Whimsy rose and moved to the window, where the landing was indeed fully visible in the pale December sunlight. The geometry of the space was precisely what he had anticipated, a clear line of sight to the upper stairs, and more importantly, a clear line of hearing. One would have been able to perceive not merely footsteps, but the quality and character of those footsteps, the weight distribution, the hesitation or confidence in the gait. "Miss Marks," he said, without turning from the window, "when you heard those footsteps descending, did they seem to you the footsteps of a man in his customary state of consciousness? Or might a man in some condition of confusion or distress produce a similar sound?" Nellie's voice was very small when she answered. "They seemed deliberate, my lord, like someone who knew precisely where they were going and had reasons for going there." "I see," Whimsy said softly. He turned back to face her, and his expression had shifted into something more profound, more dangerous in its essential neutrality. "One final question, Miss Marks, and I should very much appreciate your absolute honesty. Did you leave your room at any point during that night, even for a moment, to investigate those curious sounds perhaps, or for some other purpose?" The girl's face went quite white. "No, my lord, I did not. Though—" She hesitated, and Whimsy waited with the patience of a man who understood that the most important information often emerged only when filled the silence with words. "Though I wondered afterward if perhaps I should have done so." Whimsy nodded slowly, as though this were the answer he had expected, the answer that confirmed something he had been turning over in his mind since the moment he had crossed the threshold of Ashford Hall. He excused Miss Marks with a courtesy that seemed to confound her further, and then stood alone in the small sitting room, staring out at the afternoon light, catching the edge of the upper landing, thinking about doors that opened in the night and the terrible logic of men who understood architecture rather too well for their own moral benefit. The colonel's study occupied the entirety of the southeast corner of the first floor, a room that radiated the austere comfort of a man who had spent the majority of his life in environments designed for neither softness nor surprise. A large mahogany desk dominated the space, positioned with mathematical precision to command a view of both the door and the windows. Behind it, a wall of leather-bound volumes stood at attention, their spines unmarked and presumably unread, a common affectation among military men of a certain generation who believed books functioned primarily as architectural elements. Whimsy examined the room with the absorbed attention of a man reading a particularly complex legal document, cataloguing not what was present but what notably was not. "The colonel spent his evenings here?" Whimsy asked, his fingers trailing along the edge of the desk without actually making contact with its surface. Richard, who had been hovering in the doorway with the anxiety of a man watching someone handle his china without first obtaining permission, nodded vigorously. "Every evening without fail. He would retire here after dinner at 8 o'clock and remain until precisely 10:30. Mrs. Craven would bring him his nightcap at 10 o'clock, and he would ascend the stairs at 10:30. Yet last night," Whimsy continued, moving toward the window, according to Miss Marks, a remarkably observant young woman, I might add, the door opened at approximately 2:30, and the footsteps proceeded not toward the study but away from it, toward the stairs. He paused at the window, examining the latch with an intensity that seemed wholly disproportionate to its apparent simplicity. "Tell me, was this window ever locked?" "The study window. I cannot imagine why it would be left unlocked, my lord, though I suppose it might have been. Father was not particularly concerned with such matters. This is hardly London, after all." Whimsy turned from the window with an expression of mild amusement. "My dear fellow, the human capacity for willful blindness regarding domestic security remains one of the more entertaining aspects of rural life. One locks one's doors against the possibility of burglary by strangers, while leaving windows open to accommodate the certainty of betrayal by intimates. A curious calculus. He settled himself into the chair behind the Colonel's desk, an act that seemed to cause Richard considerable distress. Now then, I should like to understand the precise geography of this household. The Colonel's bedroom lies directly above this study? Yes, connected by the internal staircase. The small one, you understand, at the end of the corridor. Quite narrow. Father used it rarely, preferring the main stairs. Ah, the internal staircase. Whimsy's eyes had acquired that peculiar quality of brightness that invariably preceded his more unsettling observations. How very convenient. And it connects to the landing above, does it? The very landing where the body was discovered. Well, yes, but Father never took that route. It was primarily for the servants' use, or for moving between rooms without disturbing the household. Whimsy rose from the chair and moved to the fireplace, where a small portrait hung, a younger Colonel Ashford in uniform, his jaw set in the resolute expression of a man entirely confident in his capacity to impose order upon chaos. I find myself extraordinarily curious regarding your father's state of mind in recent weeks, Mr. Ashford. Had he seemed anxious, distracted perhaps, the sort of man who might conceivably rise in the night, troubled by some particular concern? Richard's answer came too quickly, which was precisely the same as saying it came too slowly. Not at all. Father was his usual self, perfectly content as far as I could determine. Content, Whimsy repeated softly. What a remarkably telling word. One does not generally apply content to a man you understand. Content is what one says of a cow or a particularly satisfied spaniel. One might say a man is satisfied or occupied or even resigned, but content suggests an absence of internal friction that is rarely accurate when applied to human beings, particularly those of a military temperament. He turned to face Richard directly, and his expression had shifted into something more penetrating, more dangerous in its essential politeness. Let us speak frankly, shall we? When precisely did your father's will last undergo revision? The question struck Richard as though it had been delivered as a physical blow. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then attempted again. That is to say, I cannot see how that is relevant to your father's solicitor is in the village, I presume. Mr. Weatherby or Mr. Ashcroft or some such traditional nomenclature. He can verify the date of the most recent alteration to the Colonel's testamentary dispositions, and I shall verify it regardless, so you may as well satisfy your conscience by being forthright. Whimsy moved toward the study door, and his tone had acquired the quality of absolute certainty that made resistance seem not merely foolish, but positively immoral. The question is whether you already knew of the changes, or whether this recent death has come to you as an unwelcome surprise. Though based upon your telegram and your evident anxiety, I suspect the latter. Your father, having perhaps recently acquired some moral compunction regarding his estate, decided to revise his arrangements. Yes? He mentioned something, Richard admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 weeks ago. He said that there were matters which required his attention, and that he had made provision for them in his will. I thought perhaps he meant some charitable donation or some such. He was hardly forthcoming about his financial arrangements. Whimsy nodded slowly, as though this revelation confirmed something he had long suspected. And you did not press him for details? No, my lord. I assumed he would explain when he felt it appropriate. How very civilized of you. How very convenient. Whimsy moved into the corridor, his mind clearly already several steps ahead of the conversation occurring in his present location. He paused before the small internal staircase, examining its narrowness, its darkness, the peculiar way the light from above barely penetrated its confined space. The stairs were perhaps 3 feet wide, with a single window on the landing above that provided the only natural illumination. To descend them in the darkness of 2:30 in the morning would require either considerable familiarity or considerable necessity. I believe I should now like to examine the bedroom, followed by a conversation with the valet James. There are questions regarding the state of the Colonel's night clothing that seem to me potentially illuminating, and I am becoming increasingly curious regarding the precise contents of his study desk. One does not maintain such elaborate order without possessing secrets of considerable magnitude. As Richard led him toward the internal staircase, Whimsy's expression had settled into that peculiar combination of amusement and profound gravity that suggested he had already perceived, in outline at least, the shape of the tragedy that had unfolded within these walls. The Colonel's bedroom existed in a state of almost monastic austerity, a space that seemed designed to offer minimal resistance to the process of sleep and maximal efficiency in the matter of daily ablutions. The furnishings were precisely what one would expect of a retired military officer: a narrow bed with military-precise corners, a wardrobe of polished oak, a washstand with its pitcher and basin arranged at right angles to one another. The windows commanded a view of the drive, and Whimsy noted with particular interest that they possessed locks of a rather more sophisticated variety than one would typically find in a country household. Someone, at some point in the Colonel's tenure at Ashford Hall, had deemed security a matter of considerable importance. "Your father slept well, I take it?" Whimsy asked, moving to the bed and examining the coverlet with the focused attention usually reserved for manuscripts or particularly troublesome chess problems. "Tolerably well, as far as I know. He never complained of insomnia or nightmares. And the internal staircase? He used it infrequently, you mentioned, perhaps once or twice weekly, to access his dressing room or to move between the study and bedroom without descending to the public areas." Whimsy opened the wardrobe and examined its contents with an intensity that seemed to Richard wholly disproportionate to the task at hand. The Colonel's nightclothes hung in meticulous rows, 3 identical sets of pale blue flannel arranged in order of age, each pressed to geometrical perfection. Beside them hung the day clothes, equally ordered, equally precise. "Tell me, did your father ever suffer from nervous complaints? Any condition that might predispose him to nocturnal wandering?" "Not that I am aware of, my lord." "He was in remarkably good health for his age. The local physician saw him quarterly, and there was never any suggestion of serious ailment." Whimsy closed the wardrobe and turned to examine the room's remaining features with the methodical precision of an inventory clerk. His eyes lingered for a moment upon the small writing desk positioned near the window, a delicate piece, altogether at odds with the room's military simplicity. Upon its surface lay several items of correspondence, arranged in neat stacks. Without asking permission, Whimsy moved to the desk and began examining the letters with the absorbed attention of a man reading poetry. "These are recent?" he asked, holding aloft a letter bearing a London postmark and the date of some 3 weeks prior. I'm not certain, my lord. I don't believe I have examined father's private correspondence." "No, I suspect you have not, though I wonder if perhaps your father's solicitor might have been aware of certain communications." Whimsy replaced the letter with precise care and turned to face Richard, his expression now containing an element of something rather more grave than mere intellectual curiosity. "Your father was in correspondence with someone in London, someone from whom he required either advice or absolution, or quite possibly both. Do you have any notion of his acquaintances in town? Business associates, perhaps, or members of his former regiment?" "Father had very little contact with his former life, my lord. He retired from the service some 20 years ago and seemed quite content to sever those connections entirely." "Content again," Whimsy observed dryly. "That remarkable state of bovine satisfaction. And yet, 3 weeks ago, he received a letter that prompted him to alter his will, acquire considerable anxiety, and apparently begin making nocturnal journeys to his study. A room, I note, that one would not typically require if one merely intended to retrieve an item of clothing or investigate a curious noise." He moved toward the door. "I believe the time has come to examine your father's study desk with considerably more thoroughness than has thus far been undertaken. I suspect the local superintendent, worthy fellow though he doubtless is, lacked both the inclination and the intellectual apparatus to recognize what might be concealed within apparently innocent correspondence." The descent of the internal stair. Assay was accomplished in near total darkness, Whimsy proceeding with the careful precision of a man navigating unfamiliar territory, while maintaining absolute confidence in his ultimate destination. At the bottom, where the staircase opened onto the study corridor. Whimsy paused and ran his fingers along the wall, examining its texture, its temperature, the particular quality of sound that emanated when one tapped it experimentally with one's knuckles. "This wall," he said quietly, "separates the study from the corridor, does it not?" "Yes, my lord. The study occupies the entire southeast corner." "Precisely. And the internal staircase terminates here, providing access from the bedroom above. A most convenient arrangement for someone wishing to move between the two rooms unobserved." Whimsy moved into the study and proceeded directly to the desk, where he systematically began opening drawers with the methodical precision of a surgeon conducting an autopsy. The first two contained nothing of particular interest: correspondence regarding household matters, receipts for property taxes, the mundane detritus of domestic administration. The third drawer, however, contained something rather more revealing: a leather journal bound in dark green morocco, its pages filled with the colonel's precise military handwriting. Whimsy opened it to a page marked with a ribbon, and read silently for a long moment. His expression did not alter, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly upon the journal's spine. When he finally spoke, his voice had acquired that peculiar quality of absolute certainty that precluded any possibility of disagreement or misunderstanding. "Your father, Mr. Ashford, was not the man you believed him to be. Not entirely, in any case, and the matter of his death has become considerably more complex than a simple nocturnal fall." He looked up from the journal. "Anne?" His eyes contained something that Richard found profoundly unsettling. Not anger, precisely, but a recognition of profound human failings, the sort of look one might expect from a confessor who had heard one too many admissions of moral weakness. "I require you to remain in this house and ensure that no one departs before tomorrow morning. I believe I must now speak with your father's valet, followed by a conversation with the village physician. There are certain questions regarding the colonel's health that require verification, and I suspect that verification may prove rather illuminating regarding the true nature of last night's tragedy." James, the colonel's valet, occupied that peculiar stratum of domestic servitude that existed somewhere between personal attendant and confessor, a position that granted him intimate knowledge of his employer's physical state, while simultaneously demanding the discretion of a priest bound by the seal of confession. He was a man of perhaps 50, with the careful bearing of someone who had learned, through decades of service, that information was currency and silence was investment. When Whimsy encountered him in the servants' hall, shortly after Richard had been dispatched to ensure the household's continued presence within Ashford Hall, James was polishing a pair of shoes with the sort of meticulous attention usually reserved for religious artifacts. "A man who takes pride in his work," Whimsy observed, settling himself into a chair without having been invited to do so. "One supposes this indicates either exceptional conscientiousness or exceptional anxiety. In my experience, these two states are frequently indistinguishable from one another." James looked up from his work with the expression of a man who had anticipated this particular interrogation and had already composed his responses with care. "I have served Colonel Ashford." "For 18 years, my lord. I take considerable pride in the maintenance of his wardrobe and person." 18 years, a substantial tenure. You would therefore be intimately acquainted with the colonel's habits, and more particularly, with any deviations from those habits. Whimsy leaned back in his chair, with the air of a man settling in for a lengthy conversation. "For instance, I find myself curious regarding the colonel's sleep patterns. Did he ever rise during the night hours? Did he ever display symptoms of nocturnal restlessness?" "Not to my knowledge, my lord. The colonel was a remarkably sound sleeper. I prepared his evening ablutions each night at 10 o'clock, and he was invariably asleep within 15 minutes of retiring, yet he was found upon the stairs at 2:30 in the morning, a considerable distance from his bed, and in a location one would not naturally occupy whilst in a state of sleep." James's hands continued their work with undiminished precision, though Whimsy detected the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. "The colonel may have awakened for some reason during the night, my lord. It is not impossible that he became confused regarding the location of the water closet or required fresh air." The water closet is located adjacent to the dressing room, a matter of perhaps 20 paces from the bedroom. Yet the colonel was found at the top of the lower stairs, which would necessitate traversing the corridor, descending the internal staircase, and then ascending an entirely different flight of stairs. A rather circuitous route for a man in search of either facility or fresh air. Whimsy rose and moved to the window, where the afternoon light was beginning to acquire that particular quality of late December, the golden hour tinged with the imminence of darkness. "Tell me, did the colonel ever mention any matters of concern to you? Anne, why anxiety regarding his health or his affairs?" "The colonel was not a man given to conversing with his staff regarding personal matters, my lord. No, I suspect he was not. And yet you served him for 18 years, attended to his person daily, prepared his wardrobe, handled his intimate garments. One would think that such lengthy association might have permitted observation of significant alterations in his physical or mental state." Whimsy turned to face James directly. "For instance, did you ever observe tremors in his hands, any involuntary muscular movements, any indication that he might be experiencing pain of which he did not speak?" There was a pause, infinitesimal but definite. James's fingers ceased their polishing motion for precisely 1 second before resuming their work. "I cannot speak to matters of medical concern, my lord. I did not ask you to speak to medical matters. I asked you to speak to observations. There is a considerable difference between the two." Whimsy moved closer, and his tone had acquired that particular quality of absolute certainty that suggested resistance to his questions was not merely inadvisable, but morally reprehensible. "Last night, when you brought the colonel his evening ablutions, what was his condition? Did he seem troubled, distracted? Did he display any symptoms of physical discomfort?" James set down the shoe with deliberate care and folded his hands upon his lap, with the air of a man consigning himself to a particular course of action. "The colonel seemed preoccupied, my lord, more so than usual. He asked me several times during the evening if I had heard any sounds from the study, any indication that someone might have entered the room during the day. This was unusual. The colonel did not typically concern himself with such matters. Did he mention anything regarding a letter, or any communication that had arrived?" "Recently? No, my lord. Though I did observe that his correspondence appeared to be in some disarray when I tidied his study the day before yesterday. The colonel was a man of rigid habits. His papers were invariably arranged with considerable precision. The fact that they appeared disturbed suggested something had occasioned unusual concern." Whimsy nodded slowly, as though this information confirmed a hypothesis he had been formulating since his arrival at Ashford Hall. "I have one final question for you, James, and I require absolute honesty. In the 4 days preceding the colonel's death, did you observe any indication that he might have been considering some significant action? Any unusual instructions given to the household? Any preparation for departure, either temporary or permanent?" James was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had acquired the peculiar quality of a man speaking words he had hoped never to articulate. "3 days ago, my lord, the colonel asked me to ensure that his dress uniform was pressed and ready. The full ceremonial uniform he wore only for formal state occasions. When I inquired as to the reason, whether some function was planned, he simply said he wished to be prepared for all eventualities. I did not press him further, as it was not my place to do so." "The dress uniform," Whimsy repeated softly. "How very interesting. And you did not find this request peculiar?" "I found it highly unusual, my lord. The colonel had not worn that uniform in perhaps 5 years. He made no mention of any function or obligation that might require it." Whimsy moved to the door, his mind already several steps ahead of the conversation occurring in the room he was preparing to vacate. "Thank you, James. You have been remarkably forthcoming, and I suspect your honesty may prove instrumental in clarifying the true nature of last night. Events. I would ask that you remain available should I require further questioning, and that you speak to no one whatsoever, regarding the substance of this conversation. Is that understood?" "Yes, my lord. Completely understood." As Whimsy ascended the stairs toward the study, his expression had shifted into something more profound, more dangerous in its essential neutrality. A man who had arranged for his dress uniform to be pressed in anticipation of some catastrophic eventuality was a man who had already decided upon his course of action. The question now was whether that course had involved his own demise or the demise of someone else entirely. And the answer, Whimsy suspected, lay somewhere within the leather journal that now rested in his jacket pocket, its pages containing confessions that no man should ever be forced to commit to paper. Dr. Thornton, the village physician, occupied a comfortable residence adjoining his surgery on the High Street, a location that granted him the considerable advantage of being able to observe the comings and goings of his patients whilst maintaining the pretense of professional distance. He was a man of perhaps 65, with that peculiar combination of genuine medical acumen and genuine social limitation that frequently accompanied the country doctor of his generation. When Whimsy presented himself at the surgery door just as the December light was fading into premature darkness, Thornton received him with the mixture of professional courtesy and provincial wariness that suggested he understood perfectly well that this visit portended complications rather than mere routine inquiry. "Lord Peter Whimsy," Thornton said, extending a hand with somewhat less enthusiasm than social protocol required. "I had wondered when you might arrive. Young Richard sent a telegram to the superintendent this morning, and the superintendent sent word through his constable that a peer of the realm had been summoned. Extraordinary business, the colonel's death. Most extraordinary indeed." "Extraordinary precisely captures the situation," Whimsy agreed, settling himself into a chair that bore the permanent imprint of countless anxious patients. "I find myself possessed of several questions regarding the colonel's health, questions to which I suspect your professional observation might provide illuminating answers. For instance, when did you last examine him?" Thornton consulted a ledger with the air of a man consulting scripture. 4 weeks ago, the 22nd of November, routine quarterly examination, as has been my practice with him for the past 7 years, and his condition was satisfactory, entirely satisfactory. Blood pressure within normal parameters, heart sound, lungs clear. The colonel was a remarkably healthy man for his age. I should have expected him to live another 15 years at minimum, barring accident or sudden catastrophic illness. And yet, Whimsy observed, leaning back in his chair with the ease of a man settling in for a lengthy conversation, you seem to suggest some caveat lurking within that otherwise glowing assessment. One does not employ the word barring without possessing some particular concern regarding those very contingencies. One is supposedly excluding. Thornton rose and moved to the window, where the gas lamps of the village were beginning to illuminate themselves against the approaching darkness. The colonel was a man under considerable emotional strain, Lord Peter, not visible to the casual observer, you understand, but evident to anyone trained in the observation of medical symptoms. His blood pressure, whilst technically within normal range, had elevated by some 8 points since his examination 6 months prior. He complained of occasional insomnia, though he attributed this to age rather than anxiety. And there was something else, a peculiar quality to his bearing, a tension in his shoulders and jaw that suggested prolonged worry. Did you inquire as to the source of this worry? I did. The colonel was characteristically evasive. He suggested that the English weather was affecting his mood and that he merely required more outdoor exercise. I prescribed nothing, as there was no objective pathology to address, but I had the distinct impression that he was concealing something of considerable magnitude. Whimsy rose and moved to stand beside Thornton at the window where the village presented its customary evening aspect. Lamps illuminating the shop windows, a handful of people hurrying through the cold toward their respective homes, the entire choreography of provincial life conducted with the precision of long practice. Tell me, Doctor, in your professional opinion, could a man in such a state of emotional distress exhibit symptoms suggestive of confusion or disorientation? Might he potentially wander in the night in a state of semi-consciousness, unaware of his precise location or circumstances? Theoretically possible, Thornton admitted. Extreme stress can occasionally produce symptoms resembling dissociation, a temporary separation from reality in which a person might perform actions without full conscious awareness of their implications. But such occurrences are relatively rare and typically brief in duration, and would such a state render a man particularly vulnerable to accident? Might he misjudge distances or lose his footing whilst in such a condition? Thornton turned to face Whimsy, and his expression had acquired an element of something rather more grave than mere professional concern. "Lord Peter, I sense that these questions are leading toward a particular conclusion. I would prefer to hear T stated directly rather than continue this oblique interrogation." Whimsy smiled, a thin, precise expression that conveyed neither amusement nor warmth. "I am endeavoring to establish whether the Colonel might have fallen down the stairs as the result of confusion or disorientation rather than as the result of deliberate action. But I suspect you have already perceived that the precise mechanism of his death is less important than understanding what prompted him to leave his bed at 2:30 in the morning and ascend a staircase that led nowhere he had any legitimate reason to be." "You are suggesting something other than accident," Thornton said quietly. "I am suggesting that the Colonel was a man of profound moral compunction who had recently discovered that his understanding of certain significant matters required substantial revision. I am suggesting that this discovery prompted him to alter his will and prepare his dress uniform in anticipation of some significant event. And I am suggesting that his midnight journey to the upper landing was not the result of confusion, but rather the deliberate enactment of a plan that he had been contemplating for some considerable time." Whimsy turned from the window and moved toward the door. "One final question, Doctor. Have you ever treated the Colonel for any condition of a nervous or psychological nature? Any treatment involving sedatives or tonics designed to address emotional distress?" Thornton hesitated, and in that hesitation lay the answer to which Whimsy had been leading. 3 years ago, after a particularly severe bout of insomnia, I prescribed a tonic containing a mild sedative. The Colonel used it sparingly, reported considerable improvement, and I have prescribed nothing since. And this tonic, would it remain in his possession? Very likely. The Colonel was not a man given to discarding potentially use. Full medications. He would probably have retained the bottle for future use should he require it. Whimsy nodded slowly, as though this confirmation settled something that had been troubling him since he had first examined the Colonel's study. "Thank you, Doctor. You have been most informative. I trust you will maintain discretion regarding the substance of this conversation. When the time comes for official explanations, the circumstances of Colonel Ashford's death will require considerable delicacy in their presentation to the broader public." As Whimsy departed the surgery and walked back toward Ashford Hall through the gathering darkness, his mind was already reassembling the scattered pieces of the Colonel's final hours into a configuration that suggested not murder, but something far more complex and deeply troubling, a tragedy of moral crisis and irreversible decision, in which the victim and the architect of tragedy occupied precisely the same person. The leather journal in his pocket suddenly felt heavier, weighted with the awful knowledge of human frailty and the terrible logic of men confronted with truths too devastating to survive. Whimsy's return to Ashford Hall occurred in that peculiar interstitial hour between evening and full night, when the house seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation, neither fully awake nor committed to sleep. The lamps had been lit in the drawing-room, and Richard could be observed pacing before the fireplace with the restless energy of a man awaiting a verdict whose implications he had already begun to contemplate. Mrs. Craven was overseeing the household's evening preparations with rather more severity than was strictly necessary, a state that suggested the domestics were aware that something profoundly irregular had disrupted the customary order of things. It was into this atmosphere of controlled tension that Whimsy deposited himself in the study, requesting that Richard join him whilst requesting with considerably more firmness that everyone else remain precisely where they were. "I have now spent the better part of the afternoon conducting interviews and examining evidence," Whimsy began, settling himself behind the Colonel's desk with the air of a man claiming temporary dominion over another's private domain. "I have spoken with your father's valet, with the housemaid, with the village physician, and with such servants as remained available for interrogation. I have examined the Colonel's correspondence, his personal effects, and the architecture of this house with considerable thoroughness, and I have reached certain conclusions regarding the events of last night that I believe warrant immediate clarification. Richard sank into the chair opposite with the demeanor of a man preparing himself for news of considerable magnitude. You know what happened then? Who was responsible? I know precisely what happened, Mr. Ashford. The question of responsibility is considerably more complex and considerably more tragic than the local. Superintendent appears to have appreciated. Whimsy opened the leather journal and selected a particular page, reading silently for a moment before continuing. Your father, some 3 weeks ago, received a letter from London. This letter contained information that necessitated his immediate revision of his will and precipitated what I can only describe as a profound moral crisis. The contents of this journal suggest that the information in question related to a matter of extraordinary delicacy, a matter involving his past, his honor, and his understanding of his own identity. I don't understand, Richard said quietly. What matter could possibly? Your father, Whimsy interrupted with characteristic brusqueness, was in correspondence with a woman named Eleanor Vane, currently residing in Kensington. Eleanor Vane is a woman of approximately 45 years of age, currently employed as a pianist and music instructor. And Eleanor Vane is your father's daughter. The silence that followed this revelation was profound and absolute. Richard's face underwent a peculiar transformation, cycling through expressions of confusion, denial, and finally a sort of dawning comprehension. That's impossible. Father had he never. Your father had a considerable number of things that he neither had nor never, depending on one's perspective regarding the mechanics of discrete relationships conducted during military service. Whimsy closed the journal with deliberate precision. Before his marriage to your mother, your father engaged in an affair with a woman of inferior social standing. When he was transferred to India, he severed the connection and subsequently married your mother. However, he was unaware that he had fathered a child as a result of his indiscretion. A child who was raised by her mother in relative poverty, who grew to adulthood without knowing the identity of her father, and who, as of 3 weeks ago, was informed of this connection by her dying mother and subsequently contacted your father to inform him of her existence. Richard rose and moved to the window, where the darkness outside pressed against the glass with almost physical weight. And father, he altered his will. Your father did considerably more than alter his will. He experienced what your village physician would characterize as a profound emotional crisis, the discovery that he had fathered a child whom he had never acknowledged, that this child had been raised in circumstances far inferior to what his acknowledgement might have provided, and that he was now approaching the end of his own life with this debt unpaid. All of this precipitated a state of moral anguish from which I suspect he saw no honorable escape. You're suggesting that he deliberately. I am suggesting that your father, being a man of considerable military discipline and considerable moral rigidity, perceived the only honorable resolution to his crisis as involving the voluntary cessation of his own continued existence. The midnight journey to the upper landing was not accidental, Mr. Ashford. It was deliberate. Your father ascended those stairs with the full knowledge that he was likely to fall, and with the hope that his fall would appear accidental rather than self-inflicted. Richard turned from the window, and his face had acquired the peculiar pallor of someone confronting a truth too devastating to deny but too painful to fully accept. But why? Why would he not simply acknowledge her? Provide for her in his will? There were countless ways to... Because your father was a man of his generation, raised in a particular social code that viewed such matters with considerable severity. Because the acknowledgement of an illegitimate child would have been construed as an admission of moral failure, inconsistent with his military bearing and social position. Because, I suspect, he believed that his death, arranged to appear accidental and therefore preserving his honor, would provide Eleanor Vane with considerably more financial security through insurance and inheritance settlements than would have been available had he lived and publicly acknowledged his paternity. Whimsy rose and moved toward the fireplace, where the flames cast dancing shadows across the study's orderly surfaces. Your father ascended those stairs in the darkness, knowing their precise location from 18 years of occasional use, knowing precisely where they terminated, knowing precisely what would occur when he lost his footing. He likely enhanced his own propensity toward losing that footing by consuming a portion of the sedative prescribed to him years earlier, a substance whose presence in his system would render him genuinely vulnerable to accident, whilst simultaneously providing a plausible explanation should an autopsy be performed. But the police, the superintendent, they concluded it was simply an accident. The superintendent is a competent man who lacks both the inclination and the intellectual framework to perceive what lies beneath the surface of apparently mundane events. Your father's stratagem would have succeeded entirely, Mr. Ashford, had I not been summoned to investigate. His death would have been registered as accidental. His insurance would have paid. His will would have been executed. And Eleanor Vane would have found herself in possession of a considerable bequest from an uncle she had never known, with the accompanying explanation that the relationship was a distant one, recently discovered. Richard sank into the chair, his expression suggesting that he was contemplating not merely the events of the previous night, but the entire edifice of his relationship with his father, now revealed to have been constructed upon a foundation of careful deception and deliberate omission. "What will you do?" Whimsy was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed upon the flames as though they contained some essential truth regarding the nature of human weakness and moral corruption. "That, Mr. Ashford, presents us with a rather delicate ethical problem. Your father's death, as presented to the public and the authorities, will remain accidental. There is no evidence sufficient to prove otherwise, and the revelation of the truth would serve no constructive purpose beyond gratifying the public's appetite for scandal. However, Eleanor Vane will receive a considerably more detailed account of her father's final thoughts and actions, delivered through the offices of a solicitor. She will understand that whatever moral debt your father believed he owed was paid in the only currency he possessed, his life itself, arranged to provide maximum benefit to those he had wronged. The following morning arrived with the grey indifference that December weather typically afforded to matters of human tragedy, the sky pressing down upon Ashford Hall with the weight of impending frost, and the promise of snow that never quite materialized. Whimsy had spent the night in the comfortable guest quarters provided by Richard, an accommodating arrangement that had permitted him to conduct several hours of correspondence and careful thought regarding the delicate mechanics of professional revelation and strategic silence. By the time the breakfast hour had arrived, he had formulated a plan of action that was characteristically precise in its execution and characteristically ambiguous in its ultimate moral implications. The local superintendent, A.M., and named Graves, possessed of the square-jawed determination typical of career policemen of limited imagination, had been summoned to Ashford Hall by telegram. He arrived mid-morning with the air of a man expecting to have his own conclusions validated rather than fundamentally challenged. Whimsy received him in the drawing-room with the courtesy of a peer greeting a tradesman, and courtesy that seemed to place Graves at an immediate disadvantage despite his 20 years of experience in criminal investigation. "A most regrettable business," Graves began, settling himself into a chair with the careful precision of a man unaccustomed to furniture of superior quality. "Though I confess I fail to perceive precisely what has occasioned your involvement, Lord Peter. The circumstances appear straightforward enough. Elderly gentleman, nocturnal confusion, unfortunate fall resulting in fatal injury. The medical evidence is consistent with accidental death, and there exists no indication whatsoever of foul play." "The medical evidence," Whimsy repeated thoughtfully, "is indeed consistent with accidental death. This is precisely the conclusion to which any reasonable investigator would arrive upon superficial examination. However, I have been engaged in something rather more than superficial examination, Superintendent, and I find myself possessed of certain observations that might warrant your consideration." Graves's expression suggested that he considered Whimsy's observations considerably less likely to prove valuable than the conclusions already arrived at through conventional investigative procedure. Nevertheless, His professional obligations required him to listen, and Whimsy proceeded with the serene confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention regardless of his audience's initial skepticism. "The Colonel," Whimsy began, rising and moving toward the window where the gardens of Ashford Hall presented their winter aspect of geometric austerity, was a man of exceptional regularity and discipline. His habits were predictable to the point of mechanical precision. He rose at a particular hour, took his breakfast at a particular hour, conducted his affairs according to a carefully calibrated schedule. This regularity was not merely preference, superintendent. It was compulsion, the manifestation of a deeply ordered mind struggling against the chaos of human experience. A common enough trait in military men, Graves observed, his tone suggesting that this observation was hardly revolutionary in its implications. Common indeed. And yet, 3 weeks prior to his death, the Colonel's carefully constructed order underwent significant disruption. He received correspondence of considerable emotional magnitude. He altered his will. He requested that his ceremonial military dress uniform be prepared for use. "These are not the actions of a man content with his circumstances, Superintendent. They are the actions of a man confronting a crisis of conscience from which he perceived no acceptable escape." Graves shifted in his chair, and his expression had acquired that particular quality of defensive skepticism that suggested he was preparing to resist whatever conclusions Whimsy was preparing to present. "Surely you are not suggesting that the Colonel deliberately fell down the stairs, that he arranged his own death? Such a thing would be suicide, Lord Peter, and I should require considerably more evidence than your psychological speculation to entertain such a conclusion." "Evidence," Whimsy said quietly, turning from the window to face Graves directly, "is a curious concept, Superintendent. It consists of those facts which we observe directly, combined with those facts which we deduce through logical inference from the observations we have made. The Colonel's body was discovered at the top of the lower flight of stairs, a location he had no legitimate reason to occupy at 2:30 in the morning. The household staff heard him descend from his study at that hour, despite the fact that his study occupies the first floor and would therefore provide no reason to ascend the stairs in question. The Colonel's valet reported that the military gentleman had recently requested preparation of his ceremonial dress uniform and had displayed significant anxiety regarding his affairs. "Anxiety regarding his affairs could have numerous explanations," Graves protested. "Financial concerns, health concerns. Financial concerns are readily available to the wealthy, Superintendent, and tend to occupy considerably less space in their consciousness than they do in the minds of those of more limited means. Health concerns would more logically prompt a consultation with the physician rather than alterations to one's will. No, the Colonel's anxiety stemmed from something far more profound, something connected to his understanding of his own moral standing in the world." Whimsy moved to the desk and retrieved the leather journal, which he presented to Graves with the air of a man offering evidence that would definitively settle the matter under discussion. "This document contains the Colonel's confession, his acknowledgement of a past indiscretion and his anguish regarding the consequences of that indiscretion. 3 weeks ago he was informed that he had fathered a child whom he had never known, never acknowledged, and never provided for. This knowledge precipitated a profound crisis from which he perceived only one honorable resolution." Graves opened the journal and began reading with the deliberate pace of a man unaccustomed to literary introspection. His face gradually underwent a transformation as the implications of what he was reading became apparent. When he finally looked up, his expression suggested that he was being asked to accept a version of events that was simultaneously logical and deeply troubling. "If this is accurate," Graves said slowly, "then the Colonel deliberately orchestrated his own death. He took a sedative that would impair his coordination, ascended those stairs in darkness, and allowed himself to fall. This is suicide, Lord Peter, regardless of the motive. Surely you recognize that I cannot simply accept this conclusion without official confirmation. There would need to be an inquest, testimony." "There would be an inquest," Whimsy agreed, "and the conclusion would likely be death by misadventure, as all such inquests typically conclude when the evidence permits reasonable doubt regarding intentionality. However, the details that would emerge during such an inquest would involve the revelation of the colonel's illegitimate daughter, the circumstances of her birth, and the precise nature of the moral crisis that precipitated his final hours. These revelations would serve no purpose beyond the satisfaction of public curiosity and the infliction of considerable pain upon a young woman whose only sin was being born under circumstances she did not control. Wimsey moved closer to Graves, and his expression had acquired an almost dangerous quality of absolute moral certainty. "I am suggesting, Superintendent, that the most constructive resolution to this matter involves accepting the apparent facts as presented, that Colonel Ashford died as the result of an accidental fall, and permitting the family to grieve in peace rather than subjecting them to the protracted agony of an inquest whose revelations would serve no constructive purpose whatsoever." The silence that followed Wimsey's proposition extended itself into the sort of profound quiet that exists only when two men of fundamentally different temperaments confront an ethical divide that admits of no compromise. Graves sat with a leather journal resting upon his lap, his fingers drumming against its cover in a rhythm that suggested internal conflict of considerable magnitude. The superintendent was, by inclination and training, a man devoted to the proposition that truth was an absolute commodity to be uncovered and prosecuted, regardless of its social consequences. Yet he was also a man of sufficient experience to recognize that certain truths, once exposed, created rather more chaos than clarity. "You are asking me to suppress evidence," Graves said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a man articulating something he had been hoping to avoid. "I am asking you to exercise professional discretion," Wimsey corrected gently, "to recognize that the mechanism of a man's death is considerably less important than understanding the human tragedy that precipitated it. The colonel is dead, Superintendent. No investigation, no inquest, no revelation of uncomfortable truth will alter that fact. What remains is the determination of how to proceed in a manner that causes minimum harm to the innocent parties involved." Graves rose and moved to the window, where he examined the grey landscape with the air of a man seeking external validation for an internal decision. "If I were to accept this conclusion, and I am not yet suggesting that I do, but if I were to accept it, the coroner would still require my assessment. The death certificate would still require completion. There would still be insurance, inquiries, solicitors' questions, the customary machinery of death and inheritance, all of which can be satisfied through the simple documentation of death by misadventure," Wimsey suggested with perfect calm. "A gentleman of advanced years, found upon the stairs during early morning hours, deceased from injuries consistent with a fall. The precise mechanism by which he came to be upon those stairs at that particular hour is a matter of legitimate speculation but not of evidentiary certainty. The sedative present in his system, which I suspect Dr. Thornton has already indicated would be evident upon autopsy, can be attributed to his chronic insomnia rather than to any deliberate attempt to incapacitate himself prior to a self-inflicted injury. And the journal?" Graves gestured toward the leather volume with visible distaste. "Am I to understand that this document simply disappears? That the colonel's confession regarding his illegitimate daughter vanishes into obscurity?" "The journal," Wimsey said carefully, "will be forwarded to Eleanor Vane through the offices of a solicitor, accompanied by an explanation that her father, upon learning of her existence, wished to provide for her financial security and had taken steps to ensure that such provision would be made. The specific mechanics of his moral crisis need not be detailed in the communication itself. The essential truth, that he cared enough to alter his will in her favor, will be conveyed without the necessity of revealing the precise nature of his final hours." Graves turned from the window and fixed Wimsey with an expression that suggested he was contemplating the suspension of everything he had been trained to believe regarding the obligations of law enforcement. "Why should I accept your version of events, Lord Peter? Why should I not simply present the evidence as I have found it and permit the courts to determine the matter?" "Because," Wimsey replied with absolute precision, "you are fundamentally a decent man who understands that the letter of the law and the spirit of justice occasionally diverge. Because you recognize that Eleanor Vane, an innocent party to this tragedy, would suffer cons." irreparable harm from the public revelation of her father's suicide and the circumstances surrounding it. And because you are intelligent enough to perceive that no productive purpose would be served by destroying a young woman's inheritance through scandalous publicity, when a simple acceptance of accidental death would permit the Colonel's financial provision for his daughter to be accepted without question or complication. Graves was silent for a long moment, and in that silence lay the entire calculus of a man's professional conscience weighing against his personal sense of justice. Finally, he returned to his chair and placed the leather journal carefully upon the table before him. The autopsy will show the presence of sedative in his system. The coroner will question this finding. And you will explain, Whimsy suggested smoothly, that the Colonel had been prescribed a mild sedative years earlier for insomnia, and that it is not uncommon for elderly gentlemen to self-medicate when they experience difficulty sleeping. The physical evidence is entirely consistent with a man who took medication to aid his sleep, subsequently woke in a state of confusion during the night hours, and attempted to navigate the stairs in darkness with predictable results. Nothing in the evidence contradicts this explanation, Superintendent. Nothing at all. Graves gathered the journal and rose to his feet with the air of a man consigning himself to a particular course of action that he suspected he would spend many years regretting. I will provide my report to the coroner indicating death by misadventure. I will ensure that no mention is made of the journal or its contents. The insurance will be paid, the inheritance will proceed, and the Colonel will be buried with his reputation intact. He paused at the door, his expression suggesting that he was struggling to articulate something of considerable importance. I trust, Lord Peter, that your judgment regarding this matter proves more reliable than my own. The responsibility for this deception rests largely upon your shoulders. I hope you are sufficiently confident in your assessment to bear that weight. I am confident, Whimsy said quietly, that the Colonel was a man whose final actions were governed by a sense of honor so profound that it prevented him from accepting forgiveness or simple acknowledgement as a resolution to his moral crisis. I am confident that Eleanor Vane will understand, when she reads her father's words years from now, that he loved her in the only way his rigid temperament would permit. And I am confident that justice, in this particular instance, is better served by silence than by truth. After Graves had departed, Whimsy remained alone in the study, contemplating the empty space where the leather journal had rested. He poured himself a glass of the Colonel's brandy, a rather excellent vintage, he noted with mild appreciation, and settled into the chair behind the desk with the air of a man who had just completed an investigation of considerable complexity and moderate satisfaction. The mechanism of the Colonel's death had proven logical enough. The question of whether justice had been served remained considerably more ambiguous. Richard found Whimsy in the study at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, the light having begun its final descent toward the darkness that December evening, imposed with almost mechanical regularity. The young man appeared to have aged considerably in the space of a single day, his features bearing the particular exhaustion that accompanies the discovery that one's understanding of a deceased parent has been fundamentally incomplete. He carried with him a leather portfolio, the Colonel's solicitor's file, judging from the professional mark, Ings upon its exterior, and he held this document with the careful reverence of a man handling something fragile and profoundly significant. Superintendent Graves has departed, Richard announced, settling himself into the chair opposite Whimsy's with the air of a man preparing himself for additional revelations of considerable magnitude. He informed me that his preliminary assessment supports a finding of accidental death. The coroner will conduct an inquest, but he seems confident that the conclusion will be straightforward. An elderly gentleman, nocturnal confusion, unfortunate fall. Richard paused, and his eyes fixed upon Whimsy with an intensity that suggested he understood perfectly well that this explanation was substantially less complete than the truth. That is not what happened, is it? That is not what you told Superintendent Graves regarding the actual mechanism of my father's death. The explanation I provided to Superintendent Graves, Whimsy said carefully, was designed to permit him to arrive at a conclusion consistent with both the physical evidence and the broader considerations of social justice that occasionally supersede strict adherence to literal truth. However, you, Mr. Ashford, deserve a considerably more forthright account of your father's final hours. You are, after all, his heir, and you possess both the right and the obligation to understand precisely what transpired within this house on the night of your father's death. Richard opened the portfolio and withdrew a sheaf of documents with careful precision. I have been examining father's affairs this afternoon. The solicitor provided me with copies of the will and the recent modifications. Father has left the bulk of his estate to me, as I had anticipated. However, there is a substantial bequest to a Miss Eleanor Vane, whom I have never encountered and whose existence was entirely unknown to me. The solicitor was equally mystified regarding this provision. He suggested that I might inquire of you regarding the circumstances surrounding this unexpected legacy. Eleanor Vane, Whimsy began, rising and moving toward the fireplace, is your father's illegitimate daughter. She was born approximately 45 years ago as a result of an affair your father conducted prior to his marriage to your mother. Your father was transferred to India and severed the connection, unaware that he had fathered a child. That child was raised by her mother in relative poverty in London and was informed of her paternity only recently, when her mother was on her deathbed. Approximately 3 weeks ago, Miss Vane contacted your father and informed him of her existence. Richard's face underwent a gradual transformation as the implications of this revelation became apparent. His initial expression of confusion gave way to something resembling moral indignation, which in turn metamorphosed into a complex admixture of pity and understanding. My father discovered that he had a daughter whom he had never known, never acknowledged, never provided for. This discovery prompted him to alter his will and to make provisions for her financial security. And this knowledge also drove him to recognize that his moral debt could not be paid in any conventional manner, Whimsy concluded quietly. Your father was a man of profound rigidity regarding matters of honor. He was a soldier, Mr. Ashford, trained to understand life in terms of absolute duty and absolute obligation. The discovery that he had failed in his duty to this young woman, that he had lived in comfortable ignorance while she struggled in comparative poverty, proved to be a burden that his particular temperament could not bear. He took his own life, Richard said flatly, the words emerging with the quality of a statement of fact rather than a question. He ascended those stairs deliberately, knowing precisely what would occur. You have determined this through your investigation, and you have permitted Superintendent Graves to conclude that my father died accidentally. Why? Why would you protect the truth regarding such a matter? Whimsy turned from the fireplace and fixed Richard with an expression that was simultaneously compassionate and profoundly austere. Because Eleanor Vane is innocent of any wrongdoing, and the public revelation of your father's suicide would accomplish nothing beyond destroying her reputation and rendering his financial provision for her subject to considerable complication and potential litigation. Because your mother's memory would be tarnished by association with a husband's moral failing that predates her marriage to him, and because the truth, in this particular instance, would serve the interests of scandal rather than the interests of justice. You are suggesting that I should simply accept the fiction that my father died accidentally, that I should permit his true motivations to remain obscured? I am suggesting, Whimsy said with absolute precision, that you should recognize that your father, despite his failure regarding Eleanor Vane, demonstrated considerable courage in his final hours. He recognized his debt, he moved to pay that debt, and he accepted the consequences of his failure with the only currency he possessed, his life itself. The manner of his death was an act of profound moral conviction, not an act of moral weakness. He loved his daughter enough to die so that she might live more comfortably. He cared enough to alter his will in her favor, knowing that his death would render that alteration irrevocable and beyond question. Richard was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed upon the documents spread across his lap. When he finally spoke. His voice carried the weight of a man arriving at a difficult but necessary understanding. "I shall provide the financial provision to Miss Vane exactly as father's will specifies. I shall ensure that her inheritance is processed without complication or question, and I shall, for the remainder of my life, maintain silence regarding the true circumstances of my father's death." "Is this what you anticipated, Lord Peter?" "This is precisely what I anticipated," Wimsey confirmed, "and I suspect that you will discover over time that your father's legacy is considerably more complex and considerably more noble than the conventional understanding of his death would suggest. He failed, certainly, but he attempted to remedy his failure through the only means his conscience would permit. That is not the narrative of a weak man, Mr. Ashford. That is the narrative of a deeply flawed human being struggling toward moral redemption in the only manner his rigid temperament would allow." Richard rose and extended his hand to Wimsey with the air of a man concluding a transaction of considerable significance. "Thank you, Lord Peter. I believe I understand now precisely why you were summoned to investigate this matter. You are not merely a detective, but a man who understands that justice occasionally requires the deliberate obscuring of truth. That is either the mark of considerable wisdom or considerable corruption, and I confess I lack the sophistication to determine which." "It is perhaps both," Wimsey replied, accepting Richard's hand with characteristic grace. "Which is precisely why I find myself perpetually uncomfortable with the conclusions at which I arrive." Eleanor Vane's residence in Kensington proved to be precisely what one would expect of a woman of modest means and considerable artistic sensibility. A small flat above a music academy, its windows overlooking a rather nondescript street wherein the ordinary commerce of London proceeded with its customary indifference to matters of human significance. Wimsey had arrived by appointment, having sent a carefully composed letter that suggested, without explicitly stating, that he possessed information of considerable importance regarding her recent correspondence with Colonel Ashford. The woman who answered the door was tall, with features that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the portrait of the younger colonel that had hung in Ashford Hall. The same precise jawline, the same intelligent eyes, the same bearing that suggested discipline and dignity in equal measure. "Lord Peter Wimsey," Eleanor said, extending her hand with the courtesy of a woman raised to understand that politeness was a form of armor against an indifferent world. "I confess, I was startled to receive your letter. I had not anticipated that anyone beyond my solicitor would become aware of my relationship to the late Colonel Ashford." "I am aware of considerably more than your relationship to the Colonel," Wimsey replied, accepting her invitation to settle himself within a sitting room that radiated both genuine cultivation and genuine financial constraint. "I am aware of your mother's death, of the circumstances surrounding your discovery of your paternity, and of the correspondence that passed between yourself and your father during the final weeks of his life. I am aware, in short, of precisely why Colonel Ashford altered his will 3 weeks prior to his death, and why he made substantial provision for your financial security." Eleanor's expression underwent a subtle but perceptible transformation, not one of surprise precisely, but rather one of recognition that the polite fiction she had perhaps been constructing regarding the Colonel's motivations was about to be replaced with something considerably or truthful. She moved to a window and stood with her back to Wimsey, gazing out at the London street with the air of a woman preparing herself for a conversation she had suspected was inevitable, but had hoped might be avoided. "He did not wish to acknowledge me publicly," Eleanor said quietly. "The solicitor explained that my father had made provision for my security, but that the circumstances of his generosity were to remain confidential. I understood, of course. A man of his standing could hardly admit to such an indiscretion. I was content with his provision, grateful even. But I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that he might have wished to know me. That is not a reasonable expectation, I recognize, but hope is not always reasonable." "Your father," Wimsey said carefully, "did wish to know you. Unfortunately, the particular configuration of his temperament and his understanding of honor made such knowledge impossible to express through conventional means. However, he did attempt to communicate something to you, Miss Vane, something that I believe you deserve to understand fully, despite the unconventional manner in which I must convey it." Whimsy proceeded to explain, with deliberate precision and careful attention to the maintenance of Eleanor's dignity, the circumstances surrounding the Colonel's death. He spoke of the moral crisis that had precipitated his final hours, of the altered will, of the dress uniform prepared in anticipation of some significant event. He explained, with the delicate care of a man handling material of profound fragility, that the Colonel's final action had been motivated not by cowardice, but by a desperate attempt to ensure that his daughter would receive not merely financial provision, but something considerably more precious, the absolute certainty that her father cared enough to make substantial sacrifice on her behalf. Eleanor listened. Without interruption, her gaze fixed upon the London street below, her body language suggesting the internal struggle of a woman confronting truths that were simultaneously devastating and profoundly moving. When Whimsy finally concluded his narrative, she remained silent for a long moment before turning to face him directly. "He killed himself," Eleanor said flatly. "My father, whom I had hoped to know, deliberately ended his own life." "You are suggesting that this act was motivated by love, by moral conviction, by some sense of obligation to me. But what I perceive is abandonment, Lord Peter. What I perceive is a man who chose death over the considerably more difficult task of acknowledging his past and accepting the consequences of his failure." "That," Whimsy agreed quietly, "is a perfectly reasonable perception. And it is also, I suspect, one that will persist for some considerable time. However, I would suggest to you that your father's final action contained something rather more significant than mere abandonment. Your father lived for 67 years as a man of rigid discipline and absolute certainty regarding matters of honor. That certainty was shattered when he learned of your existence. He was forced to acknowledge that he had failed fundamentally as a human being, that he had lived in comfortable ignorance whilst his daughter struggled in comparative poverty. This recognition could not be reconciled with his understanding of himself as a man of honor, and so he chose the only resolution that his temperament would permit. He removed himself from the equation entirely and ensured that his removal would benefit you financially and absolutely. This is supposed to comfort me," Eleanor said bitterly. "To know that my father's suicide was somehow an expression of love? I am not suggesting that it should comfort you," Whimsy replied with absolute honesty. I'm suggesting that it should permit you to understand your father as something more complex than a man who merely failed and died. He was a man of profound rigidity who confronted a moral truth he could not survive. His death was an act of terrible logic, not an act of cowardice. Whether that distinction provides any comfort is, I suspect, a matter you will need to determine through considerable time and reflection. Whimsy rose to depart, recognizing that further conversation would serve no constructive purpose. At the door, Eleanor spoke once more, her voice carrying a quality of profound sadness. "Did he ever express any desire to meet me? During your investigation, did you discover anything suggesting that he wished to know me as a person rather than as an abstraction?" He prepared his dress uniform in anticipation of some significant event, Whimsy said quietly. "A man does not prepare ceremonial dress for his own death, Miss Vane. He prepares it for occasions of profound importance. I suspect your father had convinced himself that he might eventually find the courage to acknowledge you publicly, that he might meet you and attempt to bridge the gap between what he was and what he wished he had been. His realization that such bridging was impossible, that the gap between his rigid temperament and such an act of radical vulnerability was essentially insurmountable, was what precipitated his final crisis. As Whimsy descended the stairs from Eleanor Vane's flat, he found himself contemplating the terrible logic of a man whose sense of honor had ultimately destroyed him. The Colonel had attempted to pay a debt with the only currency that his temperament would permit, his life itself, arranged to provide maximum benefit to the daughter he could not bring himself to acknowledge while living. It was a tragedy of considerable magnitude, one that would reverberate through Lena's life for years to come. Yet it was also, Whimsy reflected, a tragedy of a peculiarly human sort, the tragedy of a man confronting the inadequacy of his own nature and discovering that inadequacy far too late to remedy it through any conventional means. The fog of London wrapped itself around Whimsy as he hailed a taxi, and he found himself thinking of the colonel ascending those narrow stairs in darkness, knowing precisely what awaited him at their summit, knowing that his fall would appear accidental and that his death would provide the only form of acknowledgement his rigid temperament would permit. It was not justice, precisely, but it was, in its own terrible way, a form of grace, the grace of a man choosing to pay his debts in the only currency remaining to him, even as that payment destroyed him entirely.